And so next up is Annie Nicholls from GSK talking about the R Validation Hub.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. So thank you very much for inviting me back for a third year to talk about the very exciting topic of R validation. So I'm going to do so on behalf of the R Validation Hub today. First off, a very quick warning for those who attended last week's workshop. We ran a 3-hour workshop covering all of the themes in this presentation in a lot of detail. So if you did attend the workshop, don't expect anything new. And if you didn't attend the workshop, I'm going to try and cram 3 hours worth of material into 20 minutes. And hopefully I'll do so in a succinct way that means you can understand everything that I'm saying. Okay, I'm aware that this year we have a much larger audience. So some of you may not have come across the R Validation Hub before. I'll introduce the hub very briefly, and then I'll focus on the theme of the presentation, which is our white paper, which we released earlier in this year. So I'll cover the white paper, and then since we released the white paper, we've produced a couple of tools to implement that white paper. So I'll move on to that before talking about how you can get involved if anyone's interested in what I'm presenting today. Okay, so the R Validation Hub is a cross-industry initiative, and our aim is to enable the use of R in this industry, particularly in a regulatory setting, so where you're going to use R for submissions to regulatory agencies. We were set up a couple of years ago, and actually this has been a great platform for us. The R Pharma conference 2 years ago, we had just formed, we had just received the R Consortium Working Group status, and I came to this conference, ran a workshop, gave a 10-minute presentation, and following that, we had a lot of interest from across industry, and we exploded in growth. So as it says on there, we now have around 100 members from pharmaceutical companies, regulatory bodies, CROs, and so on, and an executive team consisting of the names that you see there. So it's been a great couple of years for us. Okay, moving on to the main topic. You cannot give a presentation with the words R and validation in the title without a screenshot of the FDA statistical software clarifying statement. So here is that screenshot. The reason I want to particularly mention it is because both the FDA statement and the corresponding ICH paragraph that's mentioned, which is contained within ICH E9, provides some level of guidance. Essentially, FDA saying that 21 CFR Part 11, which governs electronic signatures and records, does not explicitly discuss statistical software. And ICH E9 provides a sort of a fairly vague summary, which talks about the statistical software being reliable and appropriate software testing procedures being available, without specifying any details around what reliable means or what appropriate means. And that really is why the R Validation Hub was formed. Is to kind of provide a level of guidance in this space. So that led to, earlier this year, we released our white paper. So Paolo Bargo from Janssen and John Sims from Pfizer co-wrote this paper with me. And we wrote it on behalf of the R Validation Hub and based it on the thoughts and opinions of all those involved who'd contributed over the previous 12 months or so up to that point. It has a slightly convoluted title. And if you were there at the workshop, and haven't already switched off after my first statement, then you will understand why it has the title that it does. Often I get asked about how do I go about validating R? Well, typically you don't validate a programming language. You validate some infrastructure of which the programming language is a component. So if anything, you're really talking about qualifying R. But regardless of whether you talk about validating R, qualifying R, however you talk about it, the challenge remains the same. The challenge is for us as users of R to demonstrate the accuracy of the tools that we're using, or correctness, if you like, of so the statistical algorithms that we're that we're taking advantage of in the R ecosystem. The other point is when people talk about use the phrase validating R and throw that phrase around, they're never that clear on what they mean by R. So one of the things we outline in the white paper is this difference between sort of core R, which would be the 29 packages that you would install. If you went to CRAN today and you went to install R, you'd get packages like base and stats, and then you get recommended packages like survival and so on. Now, those are fairly low risk, and there's a link in the slides that you can follow afterwards when I share these to go and read the R Foundation's documentation on this. So they mention things like 21 CFR Part 11, various different regulatory documents in that, and basically openly talk about their software development lifecycle. And again, there's an accompanying document just talking about their SDLC for that. And by and large, that's the same kind of information you would get if you were to go and audit a company, without maybe some of the finer level details. Certainly at a high level, you get a good impression of what the R core team does in developing R. But then, of course, there's 16,000 packages on CRAN, plus others on GitHub and other resources as well. And they have a much more varied level of risk. Some are produced by software development companies who really know what they're doing, and they're built to certain standards and have a very strong software development life cycle and testing, including good testing procedures. Some are essentially developed for fun almost, or they're developed by students who are looking to pass a module on a degree, and they may not be so well used. Very limited. There might be very limited review of the code, if it's statistical code, of the methods that have been included in there, and that creates a big discrepancy. So we focused our approach, a risk-based approach, on accuracy and validity for all these contributed packages primarily. Now, I mentioned risk-based, and risk-based is in the title. Why did we do that? Well, the first reason is because we thought it was a good idea. But actually, if you look through the literature, the key regulators also talk about a documented risk assessment. So the FDA quote was written prior to our white paper. The EMA quote has actually come subsequently. So this is from April this year. In case anyone's not sort of right on the pulse with the subject of validation, there's a really interesting document and corresponding Q&A that the EMA released that does provide a little bit more clarity around this topic. But both talk about a documented risk assessment. So that's been the initial focus of the R Validation Hub, and is a large part of the focus of our white paper. So this is taken directly from that white paper, and is a very high-level overview of what we think that you need to do as part of that risk assessment. So I'll start at the left and try and walk you through this. So the first thing, new R package. What we mean by this is, if I'm building an installation of R packages, I'm going to start with the base and recommended packages, and then I'm going to start to add packages. So let's say the first package I add is dplyr. When I decide I want dplyr, I want to use dplyr for data manipulation, along with dplyr comes, I don't know, 50 dependent packages. So dplyr imports or depends on to work. So the first step we've got in here is a classification, and this was something that we had a lot of debate about as an R Validation Hub group. Is there a distinction between the main package and its dependencies? And by and large, if you read a lot of the documentation around validation, you should make that distinction. In the same way that the package you're using is distinct from the operating system and any C libraries that are used. They are part of the components of that package. You need an operating system and you need certain libraries potentially for your package to work, but the user will focus on calling functions through dplyr. So there is some level of information you're gonna capture for those dependencies. You're gonna capture version numbers and things like that, and you're gonna perform some checks. But essentially, your focus from a validation perspective is on, in this case, dplyr, the package you want to use. Having made that distinction, our risk assessment is then based around those packages that you intend to use. And the first key question before we get into a software development lifecycle is, what is the purpose of the package? And you can classify packages in terms of maybe they're graphical packages, data manipulation, statistical modeling, machine learning packages, and so on. But really, the key distinction that we feel makes most difference is statistical versus non-statistical. And that's because if you're going to use this package in a GXP workflow, either to manipulate the data or analyze the data through a model, all of those tasks are equally as important. It's no good having a really, really accurate model if the filter statement doesn't work correctly in dplyr. So they're all as important to each other, but in that same example, the filter statement is quite an easy one to verify. If you want to filter out all of the subjects that are not part of your ITT population, you can do so, and you can visually check it, or you can check it with another programming language. It's very easy to do. And even if it's not for your data, the fact that that package might have been out there in the community for a long time, other people will have verified that that expectation for their data sources. Whereas it's obviously a lot harder to do for a statistical package. So we made that distinction. Once we've made that, the rest of it is really about both the software development lifecycle and the usage in the community. And I suppose the usage in the community is an interesting point just to pick up on from that. Software development lifecycle is the kind of stuff you would look at if you were auditing a commercial software company anyway. So I'm going to take it for the time for this presentation. I'm going to take that as largely known and focus just on the user community piece. If a package like dplyr is widely downloaded and has been around for a number of years, there is an implicit amount of testing that has taken place of that package. Now, that might not be documented, and it might not be explicit testing, but packages don't become popular if they don't do what they intend to. So although it's not an exact test that a package or a function in a package does exactly what it claims to, it is certainly an indication. Popularity, that is certainly an indication of whether the package is likely or not to do what it claims. So we factor that in, as well as kind of standard software development practices. You know, is the code in the open source world? Is it on GitHub? So is it version controlled? What's the release rate like, and things like that? And factoring all of that in, you can see these boxes for remediation and testing. Think of those almost as one. Based on the purpose, based on the maintenance, and based on the community usage. If we feel that it is not that it has an element of risk to it, then we might go and try and do something about that. Typically, writing tests for that package ourselves. Or it might be that it's very, very low risk, and we decide not to write additional tests, to accept tests that come from the author and move that on. In any case, there's some kind of installation, performance, operational qualification that will take place afterwards, where tests will be run, and you'll decide whether or not to accept it in your environment. So that's the proposed flow that we present in the white paper, and we went into a lot more detail around that in the workshop last week, and obviously you can read the white paper if you want to know more. In terms of implementation, what we've been doing, in fact, before we completed the white paper, we started work on this. But certainly over the last few months, there's been a lot of focus on two tools, which I'll present now. The first one is the Riskmetric package. So Yilong Zhang from Merck and Doug Kelkoff from Genentech have been leading this, along with a number of other people who have contributed to that package. The package essentially collects some of those best practice development metrics. Okay, so it doesn't check. We're not checking whether the statistical functions are correct here. We're just gaining information that you would want to know about if you were auditing a company. So you want to know about the practices, the development practices. And what it does is it takes that information in and it generates you a score. Now, I've taken this slide from some of the materials that Marley Gotti presented last week at our workshop. And coincidentally, one of the packages that's on the slide is Stacks, which has just been talked about by Max. Now, Stacks is coming out here as risky, so our risk score is from 0 to 1, and it's coming out as risky. And probably a driver from that is the fact it's newer, it's not on CRAN, and I don't know, but maybe there aren't so many tests yet for CRAN versus for Stacks versus something like ggplot2, which is much more established. and stable in its development. Okay. And I'll show you a quick example on the next slide of how this would be used. But essentially, the risk that you're creating here within Riskmetric can be defined based on your own criteria. So it collects a number of metrics, and you can weight those metrics in your own way. So if you think being really, really new is less important than having a really experienced team behind it, then you could weight that, and maybe that risk comes down. Okay, so here's a quick example of using Riskmetric. Again, I don't have time to kind of show you this in lots of detail, but essentially the package is loaded, and then you can provide a vector of package names, and you can specify versions and so on as well within the package. But here's a list of packages, or sorry, a vector of packages that I'm going to feed in, and we go and collect those metrics, and then a couple of steps later, we're assessing those metrics and creating a score. So your score, as you can see in some of these things like has maintainer, is a binary classification that comes out, and that adds a score for the individual metrics and then leads to the overall score. And in fact, you can see versus my last slide, actually between writing that first slide and then rerunning this code from the second slide, the Riskbased has come down from 0.9 to 0.833, reflecting the fact that it's been around a little bit longer. Perhaps more work has gone into to develop it in that time frame as well. So you can see how that's working over time. So in addition to Riskmetric, the other tool that we have created as part of the R Validation Hub, which we received some funding for from the R Consortium, was a risk assessment Shiny application. So you can very much think of this as a front end for Riskmetric. It does have a couple of extra features at the moment. One key one is user feedback. So as much as you can get an automated score, there will always be elements of a risk assessment that you can't easily capture in a metric. How do you capture the Hadley-Wickham factor in a package, or the RStudio factor? You can design some metrics to capture that, but ultimately there is a level of confidence you get from knowing who the author is. And there will be other metrics that are like that, are just very, very difficult to capture automatically. So providing that user feedback and your own knowledge of the package is also important in that risk assessment. So the app allows you to do that as well, and then crucially generate a report which will include all the metrics and any user comments that you want to add to it as well. And that can be part of your documented risk assessment that the regulators are asking for. So again, I haven't got time to show you the app, but I can at least show you a screenshot, and you can see here, this is the dplyr package, recent version. And you can see here, these are maintenance metrics, which are mainly binary. Does it have a news feed? Yes or no. Does it have vignettes? Yes, in fact, and you can see it has 9 vignettes here. So we get thumbs up, thumbs down. It's really just a different way of viewing the data with features, as I say, you can leave an overall package comment, or interactively, several users can review this. All the comments are stored in the database, so they can come back to it and have a conversation over time and capture that as part of their review. So just in the last minute or so before I have to stop, the future. So you can basically split the activities of the R Validation Hub into 2 pieces. One is around the process and communication and understanding what the tasks are. And then the other side of that is building tools that support that process. So we have our website and we have our high-level process defined, and the white paper is released earlier this year. Our next focus is on testing. And in the workshop last week, we looked at testing both from a procedural point of view, and we also created a test framework as part of the tools to kind of start exploring how we might implement that in future. And that will be a key focus. The other key focus will be the updates to Riskmetric and the risk assessment app. So for Riskmetric, that means putting it onto CRAN, and for the risk assessment app, it means aligning it so that the development, every time a new metric gets added to Riskmetric, we see it in the app as well. Okay. So that's pretty much me. Just to say, if you want to join us, we have our website and there's links in the slides, and you get these afterwards, and you can download the tools from GitHub as well. We do encourage you to join the mailing list, and you'll get notifications of new blog posts, presentations, things like that. Basically any content going onto the website, or if we're looking for people to join any new work streams. And if you want to join a work stream directly, you can send us a mail there. Otherwise, just to say thank you to Marley for co-authoring the workshop last week, and to our TAs who made that really, really productive, and of course everyone who was involved in that. Thanks to the R Validation Hub generally, and our supporters, and to the R Pharma conference for allowing me to speak for, I guess, a 6th time with all of the workshops that I've run as well. So thanks for that, and for the slides for afterwards, I've included some further reading as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andy. Just time for maybe one quick question. I'll go with the first one from Mike Smith. Is the idea that each company follows R Validation Hub advice for qualifying R, or for R Validation Hub to approve packages for use?
It's more the former. The latter is something we have discussed, so the potential for creating a kind of a repository for our packages that we all support, and maybe through the testing efforts we might end up doing that. We might end up collectively writing tests and for certain packages and creating that repository. But the main focus is that we provide the information, and that companies take that in, interpret it as they see fit, and build out their own validation process. Essentially, you can't buy pre-validated software. It's about making sure it works for your own individual company. So very much focus on the first bit.
All right, great. Thanks. All right, so I'll forward the rest of the questions to you in Slack.